The 21st century is a fantastic century for the well-educated. It is a frightening place for the undereducated.
It's a pleasure to have you all here at this night with Sir Michael Barber. It's a pleasure to have you here in Brazil for a night of debate about public policy and education. For you all that are here, Sir Michael Barber is founder and chairman at Delivery Associates and one of the leading world experts in public policy implementation. One, I would say, most important debates of our age, where society have a lot of demands and sometimes governments don't know how to supply and to deliver such demands. I'd like to start this debate asking you, Sir Michael, to introduce yourself a little bit and having you here helping me to interview you. You have David from Lemann Foundation, managing public policy here at the foundation, and Patricia Tavares, faculty member of Insper and Lemann Fellow at the School of Government at Oxford University.
Well, first of all, thank you, Leandro, and thanks to Insper for the putting this event on and hosting it. It's a wonderful institution. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in Brazil because the Lemann Foundation invited me. Lemann Foundation, as many people in the room will know, has two big pillars. One is about improving the quality of public policy by attracting in more talented people who want to make a difference in the world. And its second pillar is about education. And as it happens, these are the two things I've spent 30 or 40 years of my career working on. So the reason I'm here is to meet people at Lemann Foundation, but through them many others, people in Brazil who want to do big successful education reform, help implement the new national curriculum here in Brazil, but also to meet people who are in state governments, city governments, federal government, to improve the quality of implementation of public policy, which is a challenge in Brazil as it's a challenge everywhere. So that's why I'm here. My background is that I was a professor of education. I worked with Tony Blair's government to implement education reform in the first term that Blair was Prime Minister, and then the second term I established the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, which drove progress on 20 big public domestic policy priorities across health, education, crime reduction and transport. And that turned out not perfectly, but it worked well. It worked very well. And we didn't know at the time, but we had made an innovation in government worldwide. And since then, many governments have tried to learn from that experience, and some have improved it and strengthened it, and some have tried and not succeeded. But I've spent most of my time since I left working for Tony Blair working with governments either on implementation of public policy in general or sometimes specifically on implementation of education policy. And Brazil is a fantastic country with a variety of significant challenges both in public policy implementation and education. So to come here and meet people and talk that through and see if there are ways of contributing to the many talented people in Brazil who want to make things better, that would be a fantastic thing to do, and it's a great opportunity to be with you.
It's a great introduction, sir. I'd like to invite Patricia to do the first question.
Thank you so much, and it's a privilege to have you here debating with us, especially because in a country as huge as Brazil, regional differences may hinder implementation of national policies, especially the centrally designed ones, such as security, for instance, or even the national curriculum. So when a public manager faces differences in qualification of public servants or political commitment, especially in an election year, what would be your best advice for a public manager that is trying to actually implement some change? And I'd like to add, what does it take to structure a delivery unit in our state government or a federal government? Because that would be brilliant, right?
Well, there's two questions
yes,
tied up in there, and they're both quite big questions.
Got carried away, yeah.
No, they're good. So let's just start on the first one.
Okay.
you've got an election coming up, you're a public servant somewhere in Brazil, maybe in the federal government, maybe in one of the states or the big cities, and you've got to decide what to do. One thing to remember if you're a public servant is, although you work for an elected political leader, fundamentally you work for the citizens. That your responsibility, they pay your salary, because the government gets its money from taxes, and even if the politics is distracted by a crisis or an election coming up, you still have a job to do to try to deliver the best value you can for the citizens in the work that you do. And so not to stop and wait to see what happens, but just to keep doing the things you're doing and try to do them as well as you possibly can. Because in the end, public service depends on an ethic of service to the public. Of course, we need political leadership in a democracy to provide direction. You pointed out that in Brazil, it's a very diverse country. It's a huge country. There are many different states, many different cities, lots of different experiments going on. And that makes it hard from a federal perspective to implement a universal policy.
Right.
On the other hand, it has an advantage, which is that whatever's going on in Brazil as a whole, there will always be some state or city doing a fantastic job. So it's a constant experiment of diverse attempts at government. I've had the opportunity to read about some of the reforms that have been successful in this country. I read about the efforts in Pernambuco state and particularly in Recife to reduce homicide rates under the previous governor. Tremendous example of very effective public policy implementation. Prior to that, I read about very successful education reform in Minas Gerais, where there was very effective implementation, and you saw the progress in that state. So although Brazil's diversity, if you see it from Brasilia looking out and you want everybody to do the same thing, it's a challenge. On the other hand, it's a constant source of experimentation. And what you see in federal systems often is that if a few states innovate and do something successful, the others follow afterwards. So I've been working in Pakistan. In Punjab, they've done a fantastic education and health reform over the last few years. Now I see the other provinces trying to emulate what Punjab has done. So there are different ways in federal systems of getting change. One is, as with your new national curriculum, universal implementation across the whole country. The other is a few states or cities show the way and then others try to follow. So there are positive aspects of having the diversity.
And as for the second part of my question, what does it take to create this delivery unit?
Yeah, on the delivery unit, the key thing about a delivery unit is it needs to be working directly for a political leader who wants to make a big difference. So you need a political leader with ambition to improve education or improve healthcare or reduce crime or whatever his or her goals are. And then the delivery unit becomes the part of the centre of that government that drives progress on the political leader's priorities. And it works well when the leader has clear priorities. I see around the world lots of political leaders who get elected but don't really know what their priorities are. So the first thing you need is a political leader with courage and priorities and ambition. The second is a delivery unit with a leader who has a good relationship with that political leader. The delivery unit needs to be closely related with the political leader, and then it needs to work with the relevant ministries. It doesn't do delivery, it checks that the government is doing delivery, it helps solve problems. And it's very important that the delivery unit isn't too much in the public eye. The head of the delivery unit should be a humble, quiet person, because when there's success, you need to give the credit to the relevant ministries, to the ministers and so on. And crucial to the whole thing is building routines into the way the political leader works. Brazil knows this very well in the last 3 years. Politics is often dominated by crises and scandals and corruption and media. All of these things are happening all over the world. And if you're a political leader, you can spend all day, every day, just dealing with the latest crisis. You're spinning around trying to deal with all of these things. If you've got a delivery unit, it just focuses on delivering the outcomes you want, and it can build routines into the way you work as a political leader. So you're reviewing progress on your priorities every month, every 2 months, and that's what works. So I worked for Tony Blair running the first delivery unit for 4 years. During that time we had September the 11th, 2001. We had a war in Afghanistan, we had a war in Iraq, we had all kinds of crises in the European Union. And the Prime Minister has to deal with those things. That's his job. My commitment to him was, whatever you're doing, we're just focusing on your priorities. 24 hours a day, we will not be distracted. We're just doing the health reform, the education reform, reducing crime, working on transport. We can't be distracted. Our slogan was, delivery never sleeps. Whatever you're doing, we just do this. We get data, we're checking whether it's working, we're correcting problems, and we're doing all that collaboratively with the relevant government departments and ministries, so they appreciate our help. We're not a threat to them, we're a collaborator.
That's the beauty of it. So is it fair to say, as an analogy, would be the unit of PMOs, the guy that is taking care of the process, so the routine is building up and you articulate the needs of different ministries. Is that?
That's part of it. We're not like a project management office or a PMO, because a PMO is managing a project,
right,
and it manages the process, as you say. In a delivery unit, you have to really care about delivering the end result for the citizen. I'm not interested in a health reform where you pass a law, write a report, get lots of media headlines, unless it changes the lives of citizens for the better. So we're always thinking about the end result. We're always pushing people to think, has this changed the life of a citizen, or hopefully many thousands or millions of citizens? So a big focus on the ultimate outcome, and then working back from the citizen to the central government. Where are all the elements in the delivery chain that will decide whether you succeed or fail? That if you just sit around in a capital city or a mayor's office, you can do brilliant things and get great headlines, but if it doesn't change the life of the citizen, if you're not connected through the delivery chain, it won't make any difference.
When you mentioned how can we attract talented and brilliant people to the most complex problems, which actually lie in the government, how can we, actually my question is going to be twofold again, so how can we attract talented young people to come to the public servants, especially when in some areas there are so many political appointees and they have no commitment to the end game, which is changing the lives of the citizens. I can mention just like head teachers in Brazil usually are political appointees, or the regional managers for the public education system. They're not in the career, not public servants, but they are actually loyal to different political commitments and compounds. So how can we actually implement management performance and change this lack of accountability culture in a system like that?
Yeah, I mean, government is difficult and never easy, and every country has its own history and its own culture, which affects the way it works. But there are some very straightforward things that you can do. The first thing is, and actually Brazil has a great opportunity right now. I'd say Brazil's been through what everybody will accept is a political and government crisis with the last few years. It's been a very, very difficult time for Brazil. Everybody in Brazil is conscious of that. Everybody around the world has been following the story because Brazil is such an important country. Right now, there are a lot of young people in Brazil who are thinking, I wish the government was more effective. They might be thinking, but it'll never get there. They might have given up hope. They might be despairing about it. They might be cynical about it. But if the Lemann Foundation or other organizations, universities, can show people a path into government, then actually lots and lots of young people would love to make a contribution to improving the quality of government. So my challenge to any young person, or indeed not necessarily a young person, who's criticizing government, who's cynical about government, who's worried about government, is give it a try. Get in there. It's fantastic what you can do in government. If you get a program right, it's a wonderful feeling when you see the children learning to read, or people's healthcare improving, or dramatic reductions in crime. All of these things I've seen. And the moral purpose is greater than in any other possible field. The ability to make people's lives better. You have to remember the quality of government is not just a technical thing or not just a political thing, it's a moral thing. If government is good, more people lead more fulfilled lives, more families are more successful, more communities thrive. So getting government right is really important. So it's a moral purpose, that's one thing. The second is you have to create routes into government that aren't necessarily the traditional career civil service route.
Okay.
And I know there are people around Brazil thinking about what those routes might be. There might be temporary roles in government. You might create agencies just outside of government with a key function that can recruit people on different rules from the traditional civil service. So you have to be imaginative about the routes in. And then you have to, among the political appointees, coming to your other point, I would say to any politician, if you can make political appointees, that's a big responsibility. If you use that just to reward your friends, you're very unlikely to make a big visionary change to the place you've been elected. If you want to make a big change to the place you've been elected, of course you want people who are going to be loyal to you, but make sure they're qualified, make sure they've got the talent, make sure they've got the commitment, the passion, the willingness to learn in new contexts how to make a difference. I work with the Chief Minister of Punjab in Pakistan. Pakistan is a country with many challenges. He's been a very good Chief Minister. Originally, after the military dictatorship came to an end in 2007-8, he was elected and they governed in the way that elected politicians had always governed in Pakistan, which is the politics of patronage. I've won an election, I'll give my friends these jobs, I'll move these teachers where they want to go because they're friends of ours, etc., etc. Then he realized that was never going to change Punjab. So he's moving from what he calls the politics of patronage to the politics of performance. And in the 21st century, political leaders who want to make a difference have to move to the politics of performance. So they're going to set some goals. They're going to tell the public, we're going to try and change the education service this much, or this much better. We're going to reduce crime. We're going to improve healthcare. We're going to make
a huge change.
Transport more effective. They've got to set some ambitious goals and then find people who will come with them to enable them to do that. So if you stick with the politics of patronage, you're never going to make progress and you're never going to attract talented people in. But if you move to the politics of performance, you can change anything. And the progress in Punjab over the last 5 years is fantastic.
So at the end of the day, I know it's because I know some politicians, they do not care, right? They understand that this performance is what's going to make the new game in the 21st century. So do not re-elect them this year, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, of course, democracy is an imperfect system.
Right.
Winston Churchill once famously said that it's the worst form of government apart from all the others. So it's the only one that we can all believe in.
True.
But sometimes that means elections. We're going to elect some politicians who turn out to be a mistake, or they just, that's the way it is. But the more you move to the politics of performance, the more the electorate will judge government
based on
whether it delivered or not, and then you've got an upward spiral.
I have a question as well before passing the word to David, just to do the link, because I think that one of the main themes here is about confidence. How do you build confidence that you are delivering is the right thing to be delivered to the people?
If you want to build confidence in a political program, a set of commitments, I think a good starting point is to understand, before you set your program, what people want, what people expect, what they would like. You might want to change that, you might want to inject some ambition, but understanding where the public are coming from is an important starting point. The second thing is you need to bring your values. What do you stand for? What do I fundamentally believe in? So some politicians believe in free markets and the innovative capacity of free markets and small government. That's a perfectly legitimate political program. How are you going to do that? Well, you need very effective court systems. You need the rule of law to operate effectively. You need maybe to incentivize people to create businesses and all of that. And you're going to look at your tax flows and the climate and your international relations. Other politicians believe in a bigger state, and they believe that the government, in addition to creating a successful economy, has a job to promote equity, and that will involve spending more money on schools than you might otherwise do, spending more money on healthcare systems for people who can't afford insurance, and so on and so on, attacking poverty. That is a perfectly legitimate program. So in designing a program, you want to know what are the demands that the people are making on government, what do they hope for, and you also need to bring a set of values to bear on that. And then you need to paint a picture for ordinary people of how you'd like the country to be different. If they elect you, how will Brazil be different in 4 or 8 years' time? And I think that setting out of a vision is one of the characteristics of great political leaders. They can say, there's a vision that inspires people, they want to be part of that Brazil. So I think that's not all you need, because once you've done it, then you've got to get elected. And once you've got elected, you've actually got to do the practical hard yards of delivery and implementation. And it's hard, and you've got to deal with all the crises that happen. But without some kind of program that learns from what people are saying, brings your values to bear, and then turns it into a vision of the future, without that, you're very likely to be a politician who gets elected to office but doesn't really make much difference over time.
Ray, I addressed this question because I think that David is going to do some questions about education, and confidence is a very important issue in this area.
Yeah, and confidence, you can create, we all know leaders, and not just, it happens with football managers as well as politicians. You can create confidence, but in the end, the confidence will only be there if you keep getting the results. And the same is true of politics. You can create confidence in, a political leader can create confidence in him or herself. But then if after a while he's talking this and the results are down here, people's confidence will inevitably drop. So you have to prove yourself again and again, and you're always going to be judged on your results. The big thing in politics, though, and government is you get elected and you start doing things. Let's say you're doing them well. There's still going to be a time lag before the results come.
True.
And that's when the leader needs to inject confidence. Through this implementation dip, you're implementing and then later the results will come. But in the dip, the political leader has to take you through, and a good leader will do that.
So Michael, I wanted to ask specifically about implementation in education policy, and often we see ambitious national reforms, carefully designed, evidence-based, look fantastic on paper, fail to make a difference because they don't change teacher behaviour in the classroom. And I would like to hear you speak a little bit about how an ambitious education reform can make the long journey from an education ministry into the classroom.
Yeah, it's a great question, David, and you put it very well in the question. And the way I phrase the same point is, you can change everything you like in an education system, but unless you change what teachers do all day, the results will stay the same. So your education reform, exactly as you say, has to get into the classroom. Several elements of that. The first is when you design the policy, again, you mentioned it in the question, base it on evidence. There's a lot of global evidence now as to how countries can go about education reform. We don't just have to make it up in each country. 20 years ago, surprisingly, that was what everybody was doing. But now there's a big evidence base of what works and what good strategic education reform for a whole province, a big city, or indeed a whole country might look like. And I know in designing the national curriculum in Brazil, you've drawn on work in Australia, in the US and other places. I think that's very, very impressive. So that's the first thing, get the design right so that it's credible. The second thing is make the case for the reform. What are the challenges, without being too critical of everybody who's currently in the system, although you do have to be critical because no education system in the world is good enough, and certainly Brazil's needs a lot of improvement. But then, again, make the moral case why we have to do this. The generations of the future need this reform. The 21st century is a fantastic century for the well-educated. It is a frightening place for the undereducated. And we have to be really clear about this. It's going to be a frightening century for anybody who leaves school without any qualifications. The unskilled work is vanishing increasingly, and if it's there at all, it's low pay. It's a very hard. So getting education right is a moral purpose. You've got to get a high floor, everybody to a high standard, and then beyond that. So you've got to make the case. But then there's a kind of practical, hard-edged bit of this. You've designed a reform, you've made the case, and now you have to make it work. And the way we think about that in so-called deliverology, the process of delivering in government, is you map out the delivery chain. So if you take an education reform, start with a child. Let's say you've got a literacy program and you want to make sure every child in every elementary school learns to read and write well in Portuguese. That would be a fantastic aspiration. Every country should want, in the national language, children to learn to read and write well. So how does a minister standing up in Brasilia and making a promise, I'm going to make sure every child learns to read and write well, how does that minister influence what happens in the brain of an 8-year-old in Recife or Rio or Amazonas? It's not straightforward at all. So you start with a child. I want you to change what happens, how this child learns to read. I've got to influence that child. The teacher must be a big influence. First, I've got to get the child to school. Once they're there, the teacher's a big influence. So then that part of the delivery chain says, well, how do I make sure the teacher has the skills to read and write, to teach reading and writing well? What materials does he or she need? What skills does he or she need? Then the teacher may be part of a department or may be answerable to a school principal. How do I make sure that the head teacher knows how to check that this teacher is doing a good job? And then there might be a little district government. How do I make sure the district government has the skills to appoint, not on political grounds, but sensible people to be good principals of schools? And how do I make sure this district can check that the head teacher has the skills to check that the teacher can teach, to check that the child is learning? And I work all the way up the delivery chain. And eventually I'll get to somebody sitting in Brasilia, and I'll get to the minister, and I'll have maybe 8 or 9 links in this delivery chain. There's one minister, but there's hundreds of thousands of teachers when I get to the front line. And we've got to work out how that delivery chain is going to change if we're going to change what the child learns. And so you map the delivery chain. This is very technical, but it's really important. The relationships between each link in the chain, are they good? Maybe the district gets on really badly with the school principals, so you'd have to change it. Maybe the state or the state government gets on badly with some of the districts. You've got to change it. And it's no good saying, well, it's too difficult. You've got to change it. And so on and so on and so on. So you go through all the links and check on the relationships. And it might be working well in one part of the country and badly in another part of the country. So you have to know not just one delivery chain, but all the regional variations. And then at each level in the chain, you say, have these people got a pressure to change? Why should they change what they do? What is the accountability pressure or the transparency pressure on that person? But not just the pressure to change, but the support to make the change. So you've got to teach reading in a different way. You're the teacher. Why should I do that? I've been teaching reading for 20 years. Why does the government tell me to change now? And there needs to be a pressure to change, but there also needs to be somebody saying, and I'm going to show you how to do that. There needs to be the development. And so this is a big system change. And here in Brazil, with a new national curriculum coming in 2020, you really have to think through how you're going to get the pressure and support combined at each level in this delivery chain. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It might work in some places, but it's not going to work universally, so you'd miss the opportunity. And that's the key thing. And exactly as your question said, start with the classroom. How do I change what happens there and then work back up, rather than sitting in Brasilia and making speeches and then hoping somehow it'll change the life of a teacher in a classroom.
What about the family? It's not part in the process of helping kids to learn.
It's a great question. So I've talked about
because they were talking internally.
No, so great question. So I've talked about the delivery chain in the system.
Right.
But if you can change what the family does, if you can persuade the parents to read to the child at bedtime, if you can change so that the parent takes the child to the library or sits in the evening and talks about some story that's in the newspaper, all of these things, they will make a huge difference. So we had exactly that challenge in England with the literacy program about 20 years ago that I was responsible for. We did everything I talked about with the delivery chain, and the teacher said, well, what about the families? And they're quite right. So you know what we did? We had the National Year of Reading.
Okay.
We had television adverts on how you could read to your child, a helpline that you could call if you wanted advice on books and how you could do that. Every library in the country was part of it. Lots of businesses sponsored the National Year of Reading. We even, I don't know what you call them in Portuguese, but on television we have soap operas.
Novella.
Yeah, so these are going. So we have the 3 very popular soap operas on English television, or there were back then, British television. You know, we went to see the script writers and we said, we're going to have the National Year of Reading. Obviously, it's up to you. It's up to you what you write because you're independent companies. But why don't you write a literacy story in? They write it in. So in 1998-9, you couldn't move in England without seeing the National Year of Reading somewhere. It was on television, it was on billboards, it was on the side of buses, it was in every library, it was in lots of businesses. If you bought potato chips, it said National Year of Reading on the packet. And so the teachers suddenly felt they were part of something bigger. So you can do that too. And by the way, the percentage of parents reading to primary age children at bedtime went from 44 to 65% in 1 year.
Wow.
Excellent.
Or something like that. I may have got the number slightly wrong.
It's a huge change.
You mentioned accountability, and you've written a lot about the importance of targets and monitoring in ensuring quality in government services. In education, we often find that teachers vehemently reject targets, and they argue that targets necessarily simplify the aims of teaching. And they have some evidence to support their arguments in that some of the best performing education systems in the world are characterised by high levels of trust and autonomy that teachers enjoy. In your view, where does the right balance in education between trust and accountability lie?
It's a very difficult question, and it's a very profound question about running an education system. In the very best, some of the best systems in the world do rely completely on trusting teachers, and to me, it's not difficult to trust teachers if all the evidence shows they're delivering very, very high standards that match the best in the world. You know, why would you don't need a pressure of accountability from government if the teachers are delivering really, really high standards. But there's only a country or two where you can say that's the case. And what you find in those countries is that the teachers themselves are holding each other to account. So I'm a teacher in a school. The whole school expects me to do a good job. And if I'm not doing a good job, somebody in the school will be helping me change or putting a bit of pressure on me. So the profession provides the accountability pressure, so the government doesn't need to. But that is very rare. In a country like Brazil, where you've got some definitely need for significant improvement in the overall system, you've got quite a lot of variation within the system. I think you do need some accountability pressure. Teachers are paid out of public funds. They, on the whole, get certainly relative to other people in Brazil, good pensions, and they have an obligation, a responsibility to use that public money, which after all is money from other people in the country. It's not government money, it's taxpayers' money. They have an obligation to do the best they can to deliver, and many teachers do that automatically. But there needs to be some pressure to improve, and there does need to be some evidence of which schools are succeeding and which ones aren't, and then the system needs to adjust. It needs to deal with the ones that are underperforming and learn from the ones that are doing best. So to me, without an accountability system in a system that needs to drive improvement, you won't make progress. And trust and accountability go together in that sense. They're not opposites. And it's no good a group of professionals saying, trust us, we're teachers, if the results are clearly not preparing the next generation for the world ahead. So I think some accountability needs to be there, but the accountability needs to be mutual. So if you set a target as a government, you're accountable just the same as the teachers are accountable. my minister, when I was doing the literacy program I talked about, he's a wonderful guy, blind from birth, called David Blunkett. Brilliant minister. Quite challenging and demanding, but one of my favourite people I've ever met. And one time he said in Parliament that if we didn't hit the target, he said, "My head's on the block," meaning, he would have to resign. And I saw him afterwards, like an hour or so afterwards. I said, "Wow, that was a bit rash." And he said, "No, we all have to take responsibility for this, Michael." And then he said, "And by the way, if I resign, you're coming with me." So he was making me accountable for that. But I think so the accountability has to be mutual. We're going to demand you deliver results. In return, you can expect us to provide you with the materials, the support to make the change.
Well, I think that you're talking about trust, accountability, and Patricia has a question about Rio.
A little bit out of curiosity, because when the system collapses or when government is unable to manage processes and then delivery, there must be some sort of refoundation of the system. I don't know how much you're following what's going on in Rio. It's not just in the security area, but in general. And I know that's not the case, but what would you recommend, or what would be possible to rebuild that space? Otherwise, how can we deliver, or again, in a state that has been
When the state collapses.
When the state collapses, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about Rio, but I've heard what you said, and other people have been talking to me about that.
Yeah.
It's a very, very difficult. What you find in, I have worked in some places where government is very ineffective. I haven't been to Rio, sadly. I'd love to go there one day. But what you find is that there are always some public servants who will do the best they can in the circumstances.
This is true.
And these people need to be cherished and treasured and supported and encouraged by the public.
Yeah.
There's, I've been in the furthest flung bits of some of the provinces in Pakistan, not Punjab and elsewhere, and even when everything was broken down, you find a head teacher doing a fantastic job, and these people are inspiring. I can remember years ago going into a very, very bad school, fortunately now closed in England, but there was one teacher in there whose lessons were just beautiful. They were inspiring. I was meant to be inspecting them, but I just thought, this is so inspiring. I was inspired, and so were the 16-year-olds. So there's always good people. So one thing is to remember the good people who, for moral, ethical reasons, will always do a good job, and never forget them and not write them all off.
Right.
The second thing is, in the end, in a democratic society, the public has to make plain that this is not acceptable, and it may take a crisis driven by media or something going horribly wrong, and these are moments when you can turn things around.
Right.
When we looked at big strategic education reforms where there was a uptick in the performance, three things prompted it. One was a change of leader, so a new politician elected who has a big vision, like we were talking about with Leandro earlier. The second one is an external report that says this is not good enough.
Okay.
Very powerful. The third one is a crisis. And in the crisis, you need to find new leadership. So there's no easy way out of what you describe. I don't know enough about Rio particularly, but in the end, remember the public servants who are doing their best in difficult circumstances.
Yeah, right.
And then in the end, the public will have to stand up and demand something different. And it may take a bad crisis to generate that degree of intolerance of what's unacceptable.
Our time is out. You have no more time to talk. Time flies really fast. It was a pleasure having you here. I think you had a great night learning about trust in public services. I think what you have just said, it's is a state of faith in government, in the state, and what you can do as a society for really changing what you want to see changing in the world.
Can I just say two things before the time runs out? So one is, I want to reinforce the point I made about how important government is for people to lead fulfilled lives. There's a bit of a tendency in the 21st century for everybody to say, oh, government should get out of the way, it's a big problem. And of course, government does some bad things in some places or some incompetent things in lots of places. But government itself is fundamental to leading fulfilled lives. You need order, you need services, you need things that work. And people should never forget that, because when it breaks down, as we were just talking about, it creates misery for so many people. The second thing to say is, if we can get this all right in the 21st century, government can create the circumstances in which all of us all over the world can lead much more fulfilled lives. And for that we need good public servants, but we also need
leaders,
good people to come into politics. And there's a general sense of cynicism about politics, and you can imagine in Brazil why that would be the case right now. But good people need to choose to go into politics. So when people go into politics and get elected, just suspend the cynicism for a while and treat them with respect. Treat them with the honour. Somebody chose to put themselves through an election, they got elected, and they get bombarded by the media. It's going to be hell for them, maybe for their families. Give them some respect, because people who choose to get elected in democratic societies are doing something important and honourable.
I have no words to thank you for these last words. I think that this would be the best way of finishing this talking. It was great to have you here, sir.
Thank you so much.